What got you into looking into Jamaican music history and looking into ska music history and looking
Yeah,
and stuff? Because I assume that's it, when you were a kid, was that common or was that something out of left?
yeah, very much so. So, okay, Britain, particularly England, I'd say England actually is the second home of reggae music.
Hmm.
So we had a lot of Jamaican and Trinidadian immigrants coming over in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. There was a whole wave of Jamaicans who came on. The original one was called the Windrush,
Okay.
and they came to help rebuild Britain after the Second World War. And they brought with them the sound system culture that had been growing in Jamaica. So they brought this party with them. And back then, England was dead. There was nothing happening.
Right.
And, it was a really kind of grey, depressing country. Uh, and as the 60s moved on to the 70s, this really strong reggae music culture took hold in the UK. The sound system culture, these big, loud sound system parties, they were all going on. If you were in the know, you could get invited to if you knew
Yeah.
people, West Indian families, if you were lucky enough to get invited to this scene, you could experience it. I didn't, but but when punk happened, punk rock kicked off in the mid 1970s, and Bob Marley lived in the UK for a little while, um, in the mid to late 70s. And there was this cross fertilization between the Rastafari, which was it was anti the system, and it was a rebellious, um, anti authoritarian philosophy. And Bob Marley, while he was in the UK, he recognized that there was this punk thing happening and that there was some sort of similar thing. The spirit was somehow the same. So a lot of those punk bands like The Clash, John Lydon, Johnny Rotten's second band after the Sex Pistols, Public Image Limited, were heavily influenced by, deep reggae, heavy bass lines. And a lot of the post-punk stuff that came out in the UK was heavily, heavily influenced by reggae. So there was this amazing cross-fertilization. I was like 10, 11, 12 years old in the late 70s, early 80s. And I lived in an area of London where a lot of that stuff was happening. A lot of the punk scene was going on just down the road from me in an area called, of Chelsea, the King's Road.
Yes.
Uh, so I saw it all, I just absorbed it by osmosis. But if you grew up in London, and particularly another thing that happened around that time was that the first wave, the first revival of the original ska scene. So we had this scene, the two-tone scene, was the first ska revival. There's been several waves of ska revivals over the last sort of 40 years, but 79, there was a ska revival that had a kind of injection of punk energy with bands like Madness, The Selector, The Beat, Bad Manners. Uh, so that was going on as well. So you couldn't help but absorb this stuff. And then there was a lot of live reggae as well. So in West London, where I grew up, there was a band called Aswad.
Oh,
Um,
I,
and Aswad, they later became a pop group,
right, right.
pop reggae group, but they were like a deep roots reggae group. And I had the good fortune to see them a few times when I was really young, like
That's
13, 14 years old.
that's pretty cool.
Um, so, yeah, and then I just never stopped listening to reggae really. By the time I was about 17, 18, I was just went through a period where that's all I just couldn't listen to anything else. I think a lot of people like me who were into reggae, um, have been through periods where they just tuned everything else out and just listened to reggae for a few years, and ska and just the whole Jamaican vibe, just soaked it up and learned everything they could about it. And it's never left me.